The Sony FX3 is undoubtedly one of the most popular cameras for those who are taking video a little more seriously, and it has been for quite some time. There's always some noise in the comment section whenever I highlight the benefits of Lumix over other brands, and the one thing that comes up constantly is, of course, autofocus. So to put this subject to bed as best as I possibly can, I'm going to show you some AF comparison tests between the Lumix S1II and the extremely popular FX3. In fact, I'll also be comparing stabilization, color science, codec options, ISO performance, and basically everything else that you might be interested in knowing if you are in the market for a new camera specifically for video shooting. I'm also very aware that Canon just announced the C50 and Nikon also followed suit quite quickly with the ZR, so I'll be looking to make some future comparisons that dive a little deeper into those newer options as well. And I'll leave timestamps to this video in the description. Just to quickly clarify, by the way, I was testing the FX3A, not the FX3, and from what I can tell, the only major difference is the upgraded LCD display. Since your potential bias towards Lumix or Sony may be poised and ready to kick in about now, I'm actually going to show you these tests without labeling which camera is which. That way it's up to you and your judgment on the AF as to whether Sony is really better and whether you can really even tell a difference. I genuinely tried to do as many different AF tests as I could from the typical range of scenarios that you'd normally see. And I know there isn't any intense sporting scenarios, but unfortunately I only had the FX3 for a few weeks and therefore I couldn't get it set up in time. Comment down below whether you think the Sony was camera A or camera B, and let me know what you're looking out for to come to that conclusion. I can reveal that camera A was the Lumix and B was the Sony. Here's an example where I was following a subject through a woodland area, and I purposely let the trees come in between us to see whether it confused any of these cameras. To my surprise, the Lumix S1II performed much better than the FX3 with the out-of-the-box autofocus settings, and it seemed like the Sony just wanted to grab focus on the closest object most of the time. In some areas though, it was clear that the Sony was way ahead of the Lumix, but in others the results are a lot harder to distinguish. I've already said this a million times and I'll say it again, I've never had any focusing issues with the PDAF Lumix cameras. And if you're just filming pretty standard client work that doesn't involve any crazy tracking shots, then really any brand should be good enough nowadays. I was using the FX3 with the out of the box settings like I said earlier, and the same for the S1II, with my speed and sensitivity set to 0. So now that we've covered autofocus, let's get onto Lumix's trump card category, and that is image stabilization. If you've ever shot with a Lumix camera before, whether that was 2 weeks ago or 6 years ago, you'll be well aware of the incredible stabilization system that they've pioneered. It's hands down the best on the market, and I thought Sony was closer to Lumix in this department by now, but it turns out they're still quite far behind. Here's some examples shot handheld at around 35 to 50mm on both the Sony FX3 and the Lumix S1II. And as you'll be able to tell, the difference is like night and day. While the FX3 does have sensor shift stabilization, it doesn't seem to be as effective when you're walking or moving. You're limited to 2 extra stabilization modes when you're using the electronic stabilizer, and those are standard and active, with the latter giving you quite a large crop. On the Lumix, however, there's many more stabilization options to choose from, including the recently added cropless IBIS, and this mode gives you a touch extra stability while retaining the full image area. You also have the standard and high E stabilization modes, as well as the boost IS and anamorphic stabilizer settings in the wider menu. I know that Sony gives you gyro data, and therefore you could always stabilize your footage using Catalyst Browse or something similar, but that's just another step in your workflow that most of us probably don't really want. I always try to avoid using a gimbal if I can. In fact, I'll avoid bringing as much support equipment as possible to keep things light. So having reliable IBIS is definitely something that I value highly. I love that with Lumix cameras I can shoot handheld all day every day and then pull that footage into my timeline knowing it will be rock solid even if I was moving around quite a lot. The next performance category is color science, and this is definitely going to be up to personal taste more than anything. Again, they're labelled A and B, so you have to decide which you prefer. In order to keep this test as fair as possible, I use a conversion LUT that is provided by each manufacturer on their website for the respective log profile. So for Lumix that was V-Log, and for Sony that was S-Log3 Cine. I didn't do any temperature or tint adjustments and instead just added the conversion LUT and some contrast to each clip so you can see exactly what your starting point would look like with each of these cameras. After some basic exposure correction, it's pretty obvious that the S1II leans a little more towards the magenta than the FX3, and I'd actually say that Sony gives you more contrast immediately after the log conversion. I found both images pretty easy to grade to be honest, although it did feel like the FX3 footage was coming in slightly darker than I'd exposed for, so that is something to be aware of. I'll let you decide what image you prefer overall based on these example shots, but realistically you should be able to pull more than enough dynamic range from each of these cameras as long as you've exposed correctly. When it comes to high ISO performance, both of these cameras do a great job at maintaining color accuracy as you increase your ISO. The FX3 has a much higher second base ISO of 12,800 compared to the S1II second base of 5,000. Take these tests with a pinch of salt in my opinion, as I'm sure you'll get clean footage from either of these cameras, and I've genuinely never been in any scenario where I've needed to go any higher than ISO 8000. I know that low light performance is considered one of Sony's top USPs, and the FX3 demonstrates this really well. Despite having a lower resolution sensor, I was actually quite surprised at how detailed the 4K footage looks on the FX3. This is your max resolution with that 12 megapixel sensor though unfortunately, and with other brands now offering 6K and 8K options internally, you may find that grabbing a body with some extra resolution could help with cropping and reframing. This is another strength of the Lumix ecosystem, and the S1II allows you to record in 3x2 open gate all the way up to 6K at 30 frames per second, and 5.1K at 60 frames. By giving you that extra room on the top and the bottom, you'll have a far better time cropping for vertical and 16:9 from one clip. I know that Canon have now finally introduced open gate recording with a C50, and I really do hope that more brands follow suit with their future releases. I mean, now even Apple has given us open gate in their selfie camera on the iPhone 17s, so it really should be a feature that every brand begins to roll out. I also tested the battery life and thermal performance of these two cameras head to head, and I was pretty shocked when the heat warning flashed up on the FX3 at around the 40-minute mark. And it was around 55 minutes or so of recording when the FX3 overheated and powered down. After doing these tests, I checked to see what my thermal management settings were on both bodies, and they were both set to standard, which is what they would be out of the box. Both were also set to record 4K 25p, and honestly I was expecting the Sony to wipe the floor with the Lumix in this department, especially after the reports of the overheating issues in the S1II series cameras. But the Lumix S1II continued recording way past the hour before eventually switching off due to battery depletion. I was using SD cards in both cameras by the way, just in case you were interested in knowing whether the media was affecting these results. The FX3 is definitely an eye-catching camera, with a design that most people love. I really like the gunmetal grey body and the various mounting points all over. There's enough custom buttons for my liking, and the port covers are also really nicely designed. The LCD screen is also just fine really, but apparently the older FX3 screen had an issue with max brightness and resolution, so this was probably a much needed upgrade for the FX3A. I don't enjoy the on-off switch on the FX3 and find it super cumbersome to use one-handed. It also throws me that you have to move the switch to the left for on and to the right for off, and I don't know why, but my brain just thinks it should be the other way around. You do get a decent amount of customization with the FX3, but one feature that I love about my Lumix cameras is the ability to long press any button to assign its function. This makes setup changes extremely quick, while on the Sony you'll have to dive into that menu and change it from there. Both of these cameras have tally lights on the front and back to make it easier to know whether you've actually pressed record. From a styling standpoint though, I think the FX3 has done this way better than the S1II, and I really enjoy the way that back tally light looks between the mode and menu buttons. So let's talk a little bit more about the price of these cameras, and really what you're getting for that money. The FX3A currently retails for £3,799 here in the UK, and the S1II is going for around £2,899, so that makes it around £1,000 cheaper. And if you take into account that the FX3 has been out for just over 4 years now, it starts to feel a little bit overpriced. With the S1II, you're getting 6K OpenGate video, ProRes and ProRes RAW recording internally, ARRILOG C2 and Vlog for your choice of color workflow, class-leading IBIS, and a whole myriad of frame rate options. You also get an EVF, a screen with better articulation, and more exposure tools in cameras such as false color and waveforms. The issue is that it's not as black and white as the spec sheet, and it never will be, so despite the fact that on paper the S1II is a superior camera, it doesn't matter if you're not invested in the right lens ecosystem, and this really where Sony have the upper hand for most people. It's more than likely that most of those who have bought an FX3 have been using Sony for a while already, and anyone that switched to the Sony system will find comfort knowing that there's a huge amount of lenses to choose from. This really is where Sony have the upper hand over every other camera brand out there, and it's going to be hard for any other system to catch up to the E-mount. That being said though, I wholeheartedly believe that the L-mount is the best ecosystem to invest into in 2025. More brands are joining each year, and now there's some really big players developing great products such as Leica, Blackmagic, Lumix, Sigma, Viltrox and so on. So from this point onwards, I'd love it if any FX3 user could just say that they got it because it was convenient for them and their workflow rather than claiming that it's better than everything else out there. I use Lumix because it works for me, and if Canon, Nikon or Fuji work for you, then fill your shoes. Sony make brilliant cameras, and with the competition heating up in this particular category now, I'm really excited to see what's next in the FX lineup.